Thank you. I think it's a very poor form of framing that's coming from side opening government, right? The way they set up this debate was in a way that tried to show you that people are literally putting themselves out to die. We think when it comes to religion, it's a form of self-fulfillment. There's a lot of things side opening government didn't tell you, and I think I'll tell you why specifically. Number one, let's talk about Indonesia in general, because what you're banning is in a country where it's very diverse. There are so many ethnic minorities that have so many cultural beliefs and have so many different religious ideologies. But at the same time, right, you're not talking about Indonesia, who's a very progressive country in the first place, right? Who people can accept the ideologies of self-harm when it comes to religion, right? You can probably talk about how suicide is bad, but you can never intervene in a harm that comes within an indoctrination of religion. Therefore, let's take Malaysia, for example, right? If you're going to tell me that puasa is a form of self-harm because I'm starving myself, I will not believe it, because what's important to me is the idea of fulfillment that comes from religion. So it's not fair for them to just come up and say, oh, it's going to be easy because it's a form of self-harm. People are not going to believe it, given it's a really strong form of indoctrination, right? Understand that Indonesia is very diverse, which means when it comes to these, when it comes to this country, right, there's so many, geographically, there's so many parts of ethnic minorities that most of the time have less attention from the government, right? And the only thing these people have is this celebration. It's the only form of identity these people have. It's the only form of pride in which they can take within their identity. This is something you cannot just simply take because it's a self-harm, right? The reason why is the fact that it's celebrated, and the fact that it's their pride, because a lot of people come to see them celebrate it, is something that you cannot just simply ban. Why? Because this form of pride is already a form of indoctrination that they believe is no longer their self-harm, but something that believe is a fulfillment to them that gives them some form of happiness, and at least something that they can contribute of within their society, right? No, thank you. Being a tatung, it's not like everyone becomes a tatung, right? Being a tatung for these individuals is not like a harm. It's a privilege, given that most of the time, these are the minorities who cannot go to the proper hospitals that you have in Indonesia, right? Being a tatung is the only alternative when there's no other alternative for these minorities. These are ethnic minorities in which tatung is the only alternative they have to reach their self-fulfillment, right? We think at the end of the day, what this celebration means to them is a form of pride and it's a form of identity that you cannot just say, well, take it away. But let's say they respond and say they will give them some form of education, right? We think number one, this is even worse. Why? Because number one, these are not people who listen to the government and just simply take whatever ministers tell them, but are people who only believe in the people who have taught them this form of religion. Which means, if you want to educate them, it shouldn't come from ministers or teachers that's telling them something that they feel coercive, but rather to people they feel comfortable listening to, which is the head of villages, people who are teaching them the religion. So if you try to educate them, it will be the very last thing you need, because they feel like you're more coercive towards them. But even then, right, we still feel that it becomes more marginalized to them. Because given that they have no other alternative in life, this means that they feel that they're targeted by the state, right? Given that there's so many ethnic minorities, they feel as if the state feels like they're the most harmful part of the ethnic minority, and they will feel more marginalized in society. And we think these are the harms that come when you actually attack a person for their celebration, right? I think I want to talk about another thing. What does religion actually mean to tatung people? Because it's not that they're just going to complete harm and have some form of self-fulfillment. The idea of religion is a form of indoctrination that you have, which means the teachings that they tell you, if you do this, you can remove every form of harm that this God of souls is taking you from the inside or whatever, right? If you take this away, they have no other alternative. You cannot convince them and say, oh, you can remove the souls of God by taking some form of pill from the hospital. They can never do that. Because even if you try to take it away, the form of mentality that they have some form of ghost or whatever inside will still exist. Sure, you can still ban the self-harm, but you can never remove the kind of indoctrinational ideals that people have already taught them. This means you put them in a cycle chamber of harm that will constantly feel guilty, right? Which means a part of these individuals will still feel that they have some God souls, but have no other alternative to resort to, given that the only alternative they have is bad. This means this cycle chamber of guilt these individuals will go through will become even worse because they have no other way to fulfill their spiritual needs, right? So what's going to happen then? We think this is a rare form of lack of characterization, right? Because what is the role of the state? We think sure, most of the times to protect the people. But I feel like in Indonesia, you don't have enough hospitals for people to begin with, right? You don't have like the best form of welfare in Indonesia. We think given that, if the only alternative people feel to get healthier or have some form of spiritual fulfillment is to create some good, like is to go through these acts, then we think it's perfectly fine, right? We think the role of the state also is to respect the freedom of choice, which means regardless of your manifesto or ideals is as a state, the first thing you have to do is respect the choice that these individuals make within a specific country, right? But no, thank you. Oh yes, before saying.
In terms of, like, for example, Jali Thakur, where men in India are going to burn themselves in the state for the idea of religion, are you okay with this because you are coercing a person to it?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. Like, the thing is, right, I don't know why also the Prime Minister was talking about consent, right? Because when it comes to self-harm, people are not doing it to harm themselves or literally wanting to die, but there's this some form of self-fulfillment when it comes to religious beliefs that you people wouldn't understand, but these people need to fulfill. But if you take that away, there's no other alternative for them to fulfill that form of cycle. But let's look at this main harm that's going to come on the outside, right? Should the state ever intervene in cultural and religious beliefs? We say no, right? Because even if it reflects self-harm, things like kabaddi, where they talk about, or puasa, when people starve themselves, right? People aren't actually dying. Like, there's no literal self-inflictment that comes to them. But what's important here is the state can never intervene, because this means not only will you then give them no resort to other alternative, but it means you further marginalize them even more. Most of the times, there's a reason why people do this. It's because it's the only alternative they have to have some form of fulfillment. When you take this away, they feel as if the state is going to marginalize them even more, or at least say that their teachings are coercive. Not only will it be a cycle of confusion for these people, but they feel like there's no other way for them to get back some form of help from the government. Which means when you marginalize them even more, you make me feel more of a minority within that society itself. These are not ethnic minorities who have already some form of privilege with the Indonesian government, but these are the people who have already been marginalized, but be even marginalized even more when you attack the one thing they have, which is their identity. Never been prouder to oppose.
Right, if you're on the speech, you will go on the PS. Yeah.
Panel, I think the opening half debate has been this. I think OG has quite rightly pointed out concrete harms of the Tatung process, whereas OO has pointed out the religious fulfillment as a non-consequentialist argument to outweigh the harms. Three things then I'm going to do an extension to break this deadlock in opening half. Firstly, I'm going to show you why we want to push people actively away from religious solutions to state-supported solutions to problems. Second, I'm going to suggest to you why in rural villages we want to give the state an incentive or give a state a disincentive to stop ignoring problems in these areas. And lastly, I want to develop further and analyze in-depth into the process of Tatung and why specifically the process and nature of Tatung makes it specifically dangerous for different groups of people. Before that, let me just disprove this argument of religious fulfillment on their side of the house. I agree that religious fulfillment is important, but I also agree in terms of what OG says that religious fulfillment has its limits. The way in which I want to break this deadlock is to suggest to you that even if religious fulfillment is important, religious fulfillment is important, but it can be fulfilled in many different ways. I'm unsure as to why religious fulfillment has to be specifically fulfilled only by Tatung. And the example I'm going to give you is that if many different regions all around Indonesia can celebrate Cap Gomeh without using the Tatung process, I'm going to suggest to you that all these regions can also access spiritual fulfillment and religious fulfillment as well. The second reason I'm going to give you is, if you think about it very carefully, their Tatung process only occurs once every year on the 15th night of Chinese New Year. If what they say is true, then for the other 364 days, these people don't get spiritual fulfillment. These Taoists don't get spiritual fulfillment. Surely spiritual fulfillment can exist in many other ways and not specifically through the Tatung process. But even if I'm going to take the best case, that the Tatung is the be-all and end of religious fulfillment, I'm going to suggest to you that the way we break the deadlock is my first extension. Why we want to push people away from religious solutions to the problems. Speaker, if you have a terminal illness like cancer, for instance, or pneumonia, we would rather seek proper medical treatment in a hospital ASAP, via going to a Taoist monk once a year to ask him for as a placebo treatment. If you're struggling to move on from the death of your loved one, we argue the radical proposition that we want you to take proper counseling to move on from that particular grief, via waiting for every Cap Gomeh to try and speak to your dead ancestor. Two reasons why we want to take this radical proposition. Firstly, we think because overall, there is a certainty and a guarantee of benefits on our side of the house, via the placebo effects on their side of the house that's a lot more uncertain. So maybe that spiritual belief that you have can cure your cancer. But I'm going to suggest to you that's only 1 in every 100. Whereas we're going to suggest to you on our side of the house, if every single person with cancer goes to hospital for treatment, there's a far higher probability that we can save more people on our side of the house. The second reason is also this idea of checks and balances. No, thank you. This means to say, if the doctor doesn't treat you well, the doctor can be legally liable. What happens on their side of the house? What happens if the spells are not cast properly? What happens during the process of possession and someone dies as a result? There is no check and balance. There is no form of recourse. And the reason is because these monks can tell you, oh, I'm sorry, but these gods were just pissed off, for instance. Or I'm sorry, but what you did was a noble act of sacrifice. And these people who are so spiritually coerced have no other form of recourse. You can't like say, hey monk, why is it that my family member died? And the monk just tells you, I don't know, because it's part of the God. It's God's will, for instance. The act of God and the specter of religion and the specter of the supernatural, all these things means that on their side of the house, it's far harder to get checks and balances. Then what did they tell us? They tell us, but religious fulfillment is the a priori right. I've already suggested to you why religious fulfillment can be fulfilled in many ways. I'm going to extend on that by talking about 3 additional things. The first is that for many of these individuals, you can't just assert that they want religious fulfillment. Because for many of them, they had no choice in this particular manner. They were brought up and they were coerced to feel fulfilled because they know no other alternative for them to feel fulfilled. They don't know other alternative for them to seek medical treatment. And if this is the only method to seek medical treatment, of course I will feel fulfilled by this method. But the reason is not because I really want this method. The reason in many instances is because people are forced into this particular method. This is where I deal with this deadlock about how they say, oh, but people won't go into state alternatives. I'm going to suggest to you that the reason why people won't go to state alternatives is threefold. The first is because many of your state alternatives is often crowded out by this particular festival of Tatung. This particular festival of Tatung specifically crowds out state solutions because it continues to add legitimacy to the monopoly of views and thought that religion has. If every single time the state says go to the clinic, but Tatung tells you, no, you can go to the monk every Cap Gomeh, there is no reason why your alternatives will be persuasive. So it's not because people don't want to listen to the alternative, it's because these alternatives are always crowded out by the monopoly of the Tatung festival. But the second reason is, I'm going to suggest to you, it's a blatant assertion for their subhouse to say people there just simply don't want to listen to the state. We're going to suggest to you that the dual functions of modernization and technology, especially for the millennial generation, means a lot of them are a lot more open and liberal. And the example is how Indonesia is a lot less religious today, or a lot of the Indonesian millennial generations a lot less religious and a lot less conservative. We think for many of these people, they affiliate a lot less to religion, and therefore alternatives can be a lot more compelling. No, thank you. The last thing they tell us is, but there is psycho harm, right? Because people feel that the spirits exist within them and they can't get rid of the spirits. So there's some form of psycho harm. We're going to suggest to you, things like spirits in your head or voices in your head can also often be interpreted as things like depression that you can get proper medical treatment for on our subhouse. So don't let them get away with this idea of, how there is psycho harm. And this psycho harm is more important than the concrete harms that we talk to you about. Before that, yes.
Look, most of the time, because of drug factors, these are people who don't have enough resources to go seek proper medical help. If that's the case, why is it this last resort who's actually having this celebration not given a choice?
Precisely, my second extension. The reason why a lot of instances the state is able to neglect, and this is my second extension, the state is able to neglect these rural villages, not give them any resources, is because they can use the excuse of religion. That in rural villages, you give the state the legitimacy to continue ignoring the problems in those areas. They have a reason to not want to fund medicine or healthcare or treatment within these areas because they know that people can rely on a religious solution. And recognizing that states often have a limited budget, insofar as you constantly perpetuate the Tatung festival, you constantly give the state no reason whatsoever to want to intervene within these festivals. Last extension, I want to talk about the process of Tatung. We're going to suggest to you that the process of Tatung and the means of possession was something that was not talked about in the opening half. I'm going to suggest to you that the way in which we possess someone and the way in which we select someone is often very insidious. We often want to select people whose souls are the purest. We want to select people whose souls are easiest to possess. That is to say, they have the least resistance. This means oftentimes you end up selecting children, and we're going to suggest to you that's extremely insidious. But secondly, the process of casting spells requires things like proper training, years and years of meditation. Insofar as there's a new millennial generation that's coming up, there's a lot less willing to take on the role of these monks, for instance. We're going to suggest to you that a lot of these spells are going to be a lot more dangerous. So even if you agree with their subhouse that there's some sort of safety, I'm going to suggest to you that insofar as a lot of these types of spells are now cast by people who are less experienced and less trained because less people want to become these monks in the very first place, what you're going to do is you're going to make the process of Tatung more dangerous. So even if Tatung was a perhaps safe festival in the past, we're going to suggest to you that in the future, it's going to be a lot more dangerous. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to stand on the side of closing government.
broad parts to my speech. First, I'll talk about what the state's roles in different cultures is, and secondly, I'll talk about the inherent process that Extension Hanyang brought to you and why their failure to deal with it is particularly harmful to the entire Gulf bench. First, what is the state's role? This argument started out in OO, but I guess was better impacted by CO. They say that people are indoctrinated and the state cannot take that away. First of all, we recognize that there's differences in culture, but the key is this, that they have to operate within the state parameters and the state boundaries of which this culture can exist. To the extent that you believe that Indonesia is a federal state, then everything that you allow culture to do must be compliant and must be consistent with the laws and constitution that Indonesia sets out. To the extent that Hanyang brought to you the idea of, for example, there's a lack of check and balance against these processes when things go wrong, then you must admit that there's also a problem, there's a problem legally with allowing these cultures to continue to proliferate in the manner that it currently exists. This is important because it means that it sets a precedence within Indonesia that culture can be used as an excuse to escape state parameters and to escape state's consistency. And this is fundamentally problematic, especially when you consider the context that opposition gave to you, that there are many different kinds of minorities within Indonesia that we already have to cater. We say that it's in Indonesia's interest, therefore, to capture and control different kind of cultures so that it can maintain its sovereignty over these areas. So we say that to the extent that this motion exists in the eyes of Indonesia, that's precisely what we need to do. But more importantly, I think Hanyang gave you good extensions as to why things won't go wrong when we try to do this, right? I think the first thing is to say that the state will compensate you for removing part of your tradition and part of your culture. I think this was a fundamental extension that Hanyang brought to you when he said, yes, and we admit in opposition's world, there's currently not enough hospitals in these areas. And that's precisely why we need to incentivize the state to go into these areas, to invest infrastructurally into these areas to begin with. We say that there's a fundamental lack of problem when they're admitting and they admit that there's no long-term solution to the indoctrination that they have. OG pointed out to you that there's current harms, but what they failed to point out to you is that these harms exist perpetually if you do nothing to the indoctrination. To the extent, and all considered that there is harms to this indoctrination and there's objective harm, then we say that they needed a solution to this indoctrination that they never once provided you. Hanyang, on the other hand, provided you concrete reasons why we incentivize the states to go into these areas in order to start a process of negotiations with this culture in order to include them in the state. This also conveniently deals with CO's extension because they say it's a level of a Chinese imposition. We say no because there's a delicate balance here. But more importantly, I think the harms that they tried to push on you was largely hyperbolized, right? To the extent they said like, oh, this is an entire crackdown on religion. Look, there's not China going to Tibet and say Muslims are not allowed to close down your malls. That's not a mosque, excuse me. That's not it, right? All we're saying is that we're taking a part and a very small subset of the specific process that we deem harmful, but we allow you, for example, to still practice Taoism. This means that there's a delicate balance that we are supporting. This delicate balance therefore allows us to mitigate the harms that we gave you on our side of the house, but as well accommodate for the kinds of things that opposition wanted to talk about. And we thought that that was particularly important. Before I move on to the next part, I'll take closing with POI. Opening?
So if this balance means you then redefine what these people actually learn in religion, then how will you feel is fair for them?
Correct. The redefinition is precisely what we're going for. We say that the culture that exists in its current manifestation is harmful. We want to change the way the culture is perpetuated. I think states has done this traditionally all the time. I think if you look at Malaysia, for instance, or Indonesia, for instance, in the past, there are some practices such as the burning and exorcism of certain people that are deemed particularly harmful, and we try to remove those elements away from those religions and as well as those things. So yes, redefinition is precisely what we want. Thank you. Next, the inherent process and why it's harmful. To this extent, I think we can give OG a little bit of credit. They use the words coercion. They also use the word no consent, but they never told you how this literally lead to coercion, right? So OG, right. What did we then tell you in CG, right? We told you there are two ways of which this coercion exists. Firstly, the frame that all took precisely feeds into our argumentation. They said that it is viewed as a privilege to be a tatung. Precisely. To the extent that you reject this privilege, what does this mean? It means that you're likely to be ostracized and shamed by everyone else in your culture. This is the exact mechanism that was only brought to you by Hanyang, not OG. Right, and this is important. The second thing here is also to understand that there's familial pressure upon you, right? To the extent that you're chosen to be a Tatung, your mother, your father, and your brothers and your sisters all will pressure you into accepting that role. This is fundamentally problematic. The particular extension that Hanyang gave to you is that it inflicted the most vulnerable groups of people within those cultures. One, the people that are children, for example. This is important because to the extent that they have no ability to resist against the coercive forces, then we say these are the most vulnerable groups that the state has an obligation and moral duty to protect first and foremost, right? But more importantly, the second reason why we have to protect these people is because they were arbitrarily born into these cultures to begin with, right? They had absolutely no control of why they were in this culture or how they were in this culture. They just accept things as it is. So to the extent that we can also agree that there are some people questioning these cultures because of the really screwed up things that things they do, then we say that these people are also vulnerable in that they cannot resist the kinds of pressures and the kinds of things that happen. This is important, and I think this deals largely with Steele's extension, because our extension told you about how, regardless of what kinds of things you have, for example, state unity on their side of the house, this is important because we cannot instrumentalize the most vulnerable people in order to achieve your state goals. We say that while we can agree that unity is important, and to the extent we can achieve that on our side of the house as well, then we say that we need to prevent the instrumentalization and using these individuals as social battering rams in order to achieve the goals that CO wanted to have. We say that's morally disgusting on their side of the house that they purport such an extension. The last thing I want to talk about is Hanyang's extension that was also left out. To the extent that we agree that there are some problems, right, that exist, right, to the extent that like spirits and religion is often used to mask the diagnosing of certain problems, such as mental health issues, for instance, they fail to come back as a response, because we say there are objective ways in order for us to solve these problems to begin with. Problem is, religion is often used to mask these things and say like, oh, it's already the last resort. It isn't. It's just defaulted as a last resort as a result of people being over-reliant on religion. Our extension told you how we want to move away from that, push them into state apparatus, and that's what we are proud to propose.
Don't contact.